Campi Flegrei just broke its own record, and the number that matters is not the magnitude. 6 days ago, Italy's Volcano Observatory published recalculated measurements from the instruments buried around Pozzuoli. One station moved 3 centimetres sideways toward the sea in a single instant. Every station around it moved 1. Then a single line reports that the caldera's deformation pattern did not change afterwards. Those 2 facts are the whole story. I'll show you what they mean and the 4 things to watch for next. On the evening of Friday, the 31st of July, at 46 minutes past 7 local time, a magnitude 4.7 earthquake ruptured beneath the western edge of Naples, Italy. The epicenter sat inside the Campi Flegrei caldera, under and around the town of Pozzuoli. The rupture was shallow, about 3 kilometers below the surface, which is roughly 2 miles, and shallow enough that almost none of the energy was absorbed before it reached the streets. That earthquake set a record. It was the strongest event ever recorded at this caldera since instrumental monitoring of the system began. It was the strongest tremor recorded anywhere in the Campania region in about 40 years. It beat 2 magnitude 4.6 events that had already occurred during 2025. 21 people were reported injured in the initial count, a figure that later reporting put as high as 26. Trains stopped across the Naples network. The port of Pozzuoli closed. Ferry passengers bound for Ischia and Procida were stranded on one of the busiest travel weekends of the Italian year. All of that is known. All of that was reported at the time, and if that were the whole story, this would be a video about a moderate earthquake in an unlucky place. It is not the whole story. 6 days ago, on the 18th of August, Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology published its routine weekly monitoring bulletin for Campi Flegrei. It is a technical document. It comes out every Tuesday. Almost nobody outside the volcanology community reads it, and buried inside it are recalculated numbers describing something the instruments at this caldera have never had to describe before. Not in 21 years of continuous measurement. The ground did not just shake on the 31st of July. The ground moved permanently, and the network caught it. Campi Flegrei is one of the most heavily instrumented volcanic systems anywhere on the planet, and the reason is bradycism. Bradycism is the slow rise and fall of a caldera floor, and at Campi Flegrei it is not a historical curiosity. It is the defining physical fact of daily life in Pozzuoli. Since November of 2005, the floor of this caldera has been going up, not in jumps, continuously month after month, year after year for 21 years. To measure that, the observatory operates a permanent network of satellite positioning receivers cemented directly into the ground across the caldera. These are called GNSS stations, and each one reports its own position in 3 dimensions on a continuous basis. If the ground a station is bolted to moves, the station moves with it, and the record shows it. The network measures the rise millimeter by millimeter, and the results are published in weekly and monthly bulletins that anyone can download. For 21 years, that record has been dominated by one signature: slow, steady, mostly vertical inflation. A rising line on a graph. During the swarm of the 31st of July, several stations in the central part of the caldera recorded something categorically different. The Italian term in the bulletin is discontinuità cosismiche, co-seismic discontinuities. In plain language, the stations and the rock they are anchored to physically jumped during the earthquake, and the jump was big enough to appear in the position record as a clean step rather than as background noise. The bulletin is precise about this. The discontinuities appear on both the horizontal component and the vertical component. Here is why that distinction matters. Bradycism is slow, continuous, and driven by the volcanic and hydrothermal system underneath. A co-seismic discontinuity is instantaneous, produced by the rupture itself, the elastic response of the crust when a fault slips. 2 entirely different physical processes are now sitting in the same instrument record, at the same volcano, and they do not point the same way. The observatory first reported these offsets in its bulletins of the 4th and 11th of August, and in the monthly bulletin covering July. As more data came in, the numbers were recalculated. The recalculated set, the one published 6 days ago, substantially confirms the earlier work, and it is the most reliable version of these measurements that currently exists. The published values break down like this. Across the central caldera, the stations recorded horizontal co-seismic displacement of approximately 1 centimetre, plus or minus 2 millimeters, in a predominantly southwest direction. Those same stations recorded an average vertical drop, subsidence, of approximately 1 to 2 centimeters, again plus or minus 2 millimeters. And then there is one station that does not fit. The station is called RITE. It sits at Rione Terra in the historic center of Pozzuoli, a few hundred meters from the harbour, and it is the reference station for this entire monitoring effort because it sits directly over the point of maximum deformation in the caldera. RITE recorded a horizontal displacement of approximately 3 centimetres, plus or minus 2 millimetres, in a south-southwest direction, 3 centimetres against 1, a factor of 3 between the reference station and its neighbours a short distance away. There is something worth pausing on in that number because the uncertainty works in an unusual direction here. Every one of these figures carries the same error bar, plus or minus 2 millimetres. On a 1 centimetre signal, that is a 20% uncertainty, which is large. On the 3 centimetre signal at RITE, the same error bar represents less than 7%. The outlier is not the noisy measurement in this dataset. The outlier is the single most statistically solid number the network produced. So the station that has spent 21 years recording the fastest vertical rise in the caldera is also the station that recorded the largest sideways jump during the largest earthquake in the caldera's instrumental record. That is not a coincidence, and it is the most useful piece of geometry in this entire story. Why RITE moved 3 times as far is not settled, and the honest answer is that there are 2 candidate explanations, and nobody has published which one is correct. Either RITE simply sits closest to the structure that slipped and recorded the largest near-field offset for that reason, or RITE sits on ground that behaves differently. The Rione Terra promontory is a coherent block of tuff, a welded volcanic rock, and a solid block responds to shaking differently than the softer material around it. Those explanations are not mutually exclusive. What would separate them is a relocated catalog of the earthquake hypocenters, and that work has not been published. The direction of the movement is worth stating plainly because it is consistent and it tells you something. The network moved southwest. RITE moved south-southwest. Both of those directions point the same way, seaward, toward the Gulf of Pozzuoli. The caldera floor did not scatter in random directions the way it would if these were local side effects at individual stations. It moved coherently in one sense toward the water, and while it moved sideways, it also moved down. Take those 2 facts together, horizontal motion outward and toward the sea, combined with a small vertical drop, and the most straightforward reading is elastic rebound across a fault that slipped in what geologists call a normal or extensional sense. The rock on one side of the fault dropped and moved outward. That reading is consistent with the mechanism that was determined for the 31st of July event itself, which was extensional rather than volumetric. In other words, the crust broke because it was being pulled apart, not because a chamber underneath pushed outward and cracked the rock above it. I want to flag the caveat clearly, because this is the point where speculation usually gets smuggled in as fact. A fault mechanism inferred from a handful of station offsets is a hypothesis waiting to be tested against a full inversion of the data. It is not a result. The observatory has not published a formal source model for the co-seismic offsets, and until it does, the extensional reading is the most reasonable interpretation available rather than a finding. But the geometry is not the surprising part of this bulletin. The surprising part is what happened to the ground afterwards. When a step appears in a time series, the first thing an analyst does is remove it. The offset is an artifact of the earthquake, a one-time jump layered on top of the long-term signal you actually want to study. So you correct for it mathematically, subtract the step, and look at what the underlying curve is doing. The observatory did exactly that, and reported the result in one sentence that almost nobody outside the field noticed. From the corrected time series, no significant changes in the deformation patterns are evident following the seismic event and its swarm. Read that again, slowly, because it is the entire story. The largest earthquake ever recorded at this caldera occurred. The ground jumped sideways and dropped. And once you take that jump out of the record, the 21-year rise picks up again exactly where it left off, at exactly the rate it was running before, as though the earthquake had never happened at all. The numbers behind that carry on in the same bulletin. Since the beginning of February this year, the average monthly uplift velocity in the zone of maximum deformation has been running at about 10 millimeters a month, give or take 3. Roughly a centimetre a month. Before that, from the middle of December of last year, the rate had been about 15 millimeters a month, give or take 3. So the rate did come down over the winter. It did not stop. Total uplift at the RITE station now stands at approximately 30.5 centimetres since January of 2025. And that figure is climbing week over week, because the previous bulletin reported approximately 30. A step further back, and the scale changes. At the end of March this year, the maximum uplift measured at Rione Terra, counted from the start of the current phase, was approximately 163.5 centimetres. Since 2005, the total rise at the center of the caldera exceeds 150 centimetres. The observatory describes the trend as broadly parabolic, a curve, not a straight line, with an average acceleration on the order of 3/4 of a centimetre per year. Roughly a fifth of that entire 21-year rise has arrived in the last 20 months, and the alert level did not change. Italian civil protection has kept Campi Flegrei at yellow, the attention phase, since 2012. It was not raised after the 31st of July, and it has not been raised since. The observatory's standing formulation in every weekly bulletin is that, on the basis of the current picture of volcanic activity, no elements are evident such as to suggest significant short-term evolutions. Now we get to the part that actually matters, and it requires walking through the physics for a moment because the conclusion is genuinely counterintuitive. If the ground at Campi Flegrei were rising because elastic strain was accumulating in the shallow crust, rock being bent, storing energy like a loaded spring, then a large release event should reduce that strain. The spring unloads, the uplift slows, stalls, or partially reverses. That is what a lot of people expected. And in the days after the 31st of July, there was open speculation that a shock that size had relieved enough pressure to turn the inflation around. It did not happen, and it has not happened before either. This was not the first magnitude 4+ event of this crisis, and no previous one reversed the uplift. What that non-response tells you is that the uplift is not being driven by stored strain in the rock above. It is being driven from below, by fluid and gas being supplied into the system. In that picture, the earthquake relieved stress in the roof of the system without touching the source underneath, and the source simply kept supplying. The roof cracked. The engine kept running. There is now a body of peer-reviewed work that gives this a physical structure. Research published in Nature Communications last year mapped the three-dimensional architecture of this caldera and identified an arc-shaped caprock horizon at roughly 1 to 2 kilometers below the surface, a mechanically strong layer acting as a seal, sitting above a gas-charged reservoir that extends from about 2 to 4 kilometers down. In that model, the interaction between the pressurized reservoir and the caprock confining it is what drives the ground upward. And critically, the spatial and temporal patterns in the seismicity indicate that the caprock is the first structural element to fail, producing exactly the kind of small-magnitude, shallow earthquakes this caldera has been producing for years. If that framework is right, then the 31st of July event and the co-seismic offsets that came with it were events in the roof, not events in the reservoir, which would explain both things at once: why the earthquake was able to set a magnitude record, and why the long-term deformation did not react to it in any measurable way. That is simultaneously reassuring and not. It is reassuring because a normal faulting rupture in a caprock is not an eruption and does not indicate one. It is not reassuring because the thing doing the pushing was never touched, and it is still pushing on an accelerating long-term trend. A centimetre a month sounds like nothing. It is the width of a fingernail. It is invisible on any human timescale, and if you stood in Pozzuoli for a week, you would not perceive it. Run it for 21 years, and it stops being invisible because the built environment does not tolerate it. This is where the abstraction ends, and the story becomes something you can photograph. Roberto Castelluccio, professor of technical architecture at the University of Naples, Federico II, and seismic risk consultant to the municipality of Pozzuoli, has laid out the damage publicly. The magnitude 4.7 on the 31st of July damaged the Pozzuoli aqueduct in multiple places, producing around 15 separate water losses and leaving buildings without water. Over the past 3 years, he says, ground deformation from bradycism has impacted the water, gas, and electrical networks across the area, and the railway network has been deformed by the progressive uplift. The geometry of the track no longer matches the geometry it was built to. Think about what that means mechanically. A railway is a set of tolerances. A pipe network is a set of tolerances. Every one of those systems was engineered assuming the ground beneath it would hold still. When the ground rises unevenly across the town, those tolerances get consumed slowly from underneath until something fails. And then it fails again somewhere else the following month. Castelluccio has gone further than describing damage. He has publicly raised the question of population density in the most vulnerable areas and argued for gradually redistributing people away from zones like Rione Terra and Solfatara, and for drawing up a new plan for the territory as a whole. That is a significant thing for a municipal consultant to say out loud, and it points at the harder problem underneath all of this. The engineering conversation and the housing conversation are the same conversation, and neither one has a clean answer. The clearest single demonstration of what bradycism does is the port of Pozzuoli, and it is worth spending a minute on because it makes the number physical in a way nothing else does. The quays at Pozzuoli have risen more than 1.5 meters relative to sea level as a result of bradyseism. Not the water dropping, the land rising, carrying the concrete up with it. That has made loading and unloading operations awkward and at times dangerous, because a harbour is fundamentally a fixed set of relationships between a quay and a ferry deck, between a loading ramp and a vehicle, between a hull and the water underneath it. Raise the land by 1.5 meters, and every one of those relationships breaks at once. The response has been improvised and ongoing. In the middle of July, a floating platform named Campania was brought into service at the Emporio Ovest Quay, specifically to compensate for the imbalance bradyseism has created and to keep ferry service to Ischia and Procida operable. A floating pontoon rises and falls with the sea rather than with the land, which is the entire point. Then came the 31st of July. The earthquake opened cracks in the access lanes to the commercial quays, and the port was closed outright. It reopened the following day under Maritime Authority Ordinance No. 80. But restrictions on heavy vehicles at the quay have continued to disrupt the regular supply of essential goods to the islands, and by the third week of August, the situation had escalated to a threat to suspend food supply operations entirely unless a solution was found. The proposals under discussion included moving every ferry route from Pozzuoli to Naples, or granting temporary exemptions that would let heavy vehicles cross restricted roads at reduced speed. 2 islands, with a combined population in the tens of thousands, were, at that point, one logistics dispute away from a supply interruption because of a centimetre a month. And then there is the human ledger, which is the part of this story that has not stopped moving. Take 2 official snapshots from the municipal emergency reporting, 2 days apart. As of the 19th of August, 367 evacuation orders issued by the municipality of Pozzuoli, 1,391 family units affected, 3,488 people being assisted, of whom 3,321 had found their own accommodation, 143 were in hotels, and 52 were housed at the Palatrinconi Sports Hall. 215 buildings declared uninhabitable, covering 1,081 housing units. As of the 21st of August, 2 days later, 3,627 people displaced, 1,443 family units evacuated, 408 evacuation orders, 1,486 fire brigade interventions, with 21 squads still engaged. 19 places of worship declared uninhabitable, with work underway alongside the fire brigade, the superintendency, and the diocese to secure and relocate artworks and furnishings. Do the arithmetic on those 2 snapshots. In 2 days, the evacuation order count rose by 41. The displaced population rose by 139 people. 3 weeks after the shaking stopped, the numbers were still climbing. Not because anything new had ruptured, but because building inspectors were still working their way through the housing stock and finding more that could not be occupied. That is a slow-motion secondary disaster running on inspection timescales rather than seismic ones. And it has a policy consequence that is easy to miss. Every measure calibrated on the early figures was calibrated on an undercount. Decree Law 144, published on the 7th of August and in force from the 8th, set up monthly housing contributions for families whose homes were evacuated, with a supplement of up to €200 a month for household members over 65 or with significant disability, running until a stable housing solution is found and no later than the end of 2027. A civil protection decree on the 17th of August allocated €1 million against it, but as of the 19th of August, 481 contribution applications out of 1,207 were still unsettled. About 40% 3 weeks in. The frustration on the ground is not subtle. On the 4th of August, roughly 2,000 people marched through Pozzuoli over the handling of the emergency and ended by occupying a quay at the port, briefly cutting the island ferry links themselves. The occupation ended after about an hour, once a commitment was secured to a direct meeting between a delegation of residents and the Interior Minister. In Boccoli, one of the red zone towns, the mayor has been blunt about the pace of works. The funds are there, he says. The problem is spending them and starting the construction sites. €11 million allocated, and work not yet begun. So where does this leave us? And what are the specific things that will actually tell us something in the weeks ahead? 4 of them, and they are all checkable. The first is the monthly bulletin for August. The observatory has stated explicitly that the co-seismic values published 6 days ago are updated but not definitive, and that a final estimate will be recalculated once processing results from scientific software and final satellite orbital products are available. That definitive set goes into the August monthly bulletin. It will either confirm the 1 centimetre, 3 centimetre, and 1 to 2 centimetre figures, or revise them, and it will contain the fully corrected time series. It is the single most checkable follow-up in this story, and it is due within weeks. The second is whether the right offset holds. Right now, 3 centimetres of south-southwest movement at Rione Terra is a step in a graph. If it stays put, it is permanent tectonic offset. The ground moved, and it is staying moved. If it creeps partway back over the coming weeks, then a portion of it was elastic, and what looked like permanent displacement was partly the rock relaxing. Post-seismic relaxation is common after ruptures. Nobody has published which of those is happening here, and the answer genuinely changes how the rupture should be understood. The third is the uplift rate itself. 10 millimeters a month is the current figure. 15 was the figure over last winter. If the rate stays near 10, the deceleration that began in February is holding. If it climbs back toward 15, or past it, that is the parabola reasserting itself, and it is the number to watch above all the others. And the fourth is the displacement count. When the evacuation order curve finally flattens, the true footprint of the 31st of July will be known for the first time, and only then can anyone say whether the relief measures were sized for the crisis that actually exists. One thing to be clear about before we finish, because the temptation to overread this is strong. Nothing in the 18th of August bulletin says magma is moving toward the surface. Nothing in it forecasts an eruption. The alert level is unchanged, and the institutional position is that no elements are evident, suggesting significant short-term evolution. This is not an eruption countdown, and anyone selling it as one is ahead of the data. What the bulletin does say is narrower, and in its own way, harder. The most closely watched volcano in Europe absorbed the largest earthquake in its instrumental record. The instruments caught the ground jumping sideways toward the sea and dropping. And then, the 21-year rise resumed at the same rate, on the same curve as if nothing had happened, which tells us the earthquake broke the roof and left whatever is underneath completely untouched. Roughly 500,000 people live inside the red zone around this caldera. The last time it erupted was 1538, when a new hill pushed itself out of the ground west of Pozzuoli over the course of about a week, after years of the land rising first. Nobody is forecasting a repeat. But the honest position, and the one the scientists themselves keep returning to, is that nobody can say what stage of this phenomenon we are currently in. And that uncertainty, not any hidden prediction, is the actual problem. The next bulletin lands within weeks. We will be watching for it.